Today, I will be presenting on John Markoff's journalistic novel, What the Dormouse Said, How the 60s Counterculture Shaped the Personal Computer Industry. And I'd just like to start by reading some lyrics from a popular song of the era in an attempt to sort of capture the zeitgeist, if you will. We should be together. Come on, all you people standing round. Our life's too fine to let it die. We should be together. Another line from the same song. We must begin here and now, a new continent of earth and fire. These lyrics are drawn from the song We Can Be Together, from the seminal album Volunteers by Jefferson Airplane. The title of John Markoff's novel is actually drawn from another Jefferson Airplane song, White Rabbit. And we can see from these lyrics sort of what was in the air at the time. There was a spirit of democracy and a hope for a better future. And they felt empowered to create it right there and then. And this is important, this spirit, to Markoff's novel, because Markoff believes that it was exactly this spirit that birthed personal computing, an idea that, of course, obviously revolutionized the world. Now, past discussions of personal computing and the invention of personal computing have focused mostly on large corporations such as Xerox, or, of course, the garage endeavors of one Steve Jobs and his pal Wozniak. But Markoff makes a marked attempt in this novel to shift the geographical focus of the development of personal computing to that of the Stanford campus in the 1960s. And much of his novel focuses on two research institutions at Stanford during this time. One of them is the Stanford Artificial Intelligence Laboratory, and the other is the Augment project run by Douglas Engelbart at the Stanford Research Institute. Now, the attempt to shift the development of personal computing, to Stanford is incredibly important to Markoff's argument that the spirit of the 1960s counterculture influenced personal computing, because Stanford is about 40 miles from San Francisco, which was probably one of the countercultural epicenters, perhaps other than maybe London or New York. And by placing the development of personal computing in this area and at this time, Markoff is able to sort of draw in the influences of the surrounding counterculture and sort of explain how they might have shaped the development of personal computing. Now, Markoff's novel it's not a sort of a dry trek through like rigorous explanations of various papers that were produced in Stanford at the time. Markoff's novel is very story-based and almost humanistic. It focuses on people and the things that they were doing, and the key individual in Markoff's novel really is the aforementioned Douglas Engelbart, who ran the Augment project at the Stanford Research Institute. Now, Engelbart is important to Markoff's argument primarily because Markoff sees him as sort of the father of personal computing. Douglas Engelbart managed to, or saw that computing could be something more than just, at the time, it was just solely big number crunchers for financial institutions and military endeavors. Engelbart saw that computing could be used to help people, and that people could have a personal relationship with computers, that it could be an interactive experience rather than you simply tell the computer what sort of calculations to do and then input numbers. Now, to add to the futurism of Engelbart's vision, Engelbart actually, at this time, was able to envision a workstation complete with a monitor, a keyboard, and some sort of device, other devices for inputting information into the computer. And this is what Douglas Engelbart chose to begin pursuing when he began work at Stanford in 1957, even though work on his augment project didn't begin in earnest until 62, 63. And it's not simply that Douglas Engelbart was able to conceive of these things. We all know, of course, that conceptions are a dime a dozen, right? What matters is the application. And the augment project of Douglas Engelbart, even though he later believed that it had been a failure, was actually somewhat of a great success during its day. There was a demonstration of his augment project in 1968, and during this he used a computer terminal, a screen, to input text and to combine text and graphics and video, and even create links between different documents. And of course, we now know these functions as sort of some of these standard repertory of functions of Office software, which is a major market in personal computing. And now Douglas Engelbart is, and the description of him by Markoff in Markoff's novel is enough, I think, to position the development of personal computing at Stanford. The Augment Project and Douglas Engelbart's vision are fantastically futuristic. Really, I mean, he was even using workstation some 30 years before it would come into the sort of popular jargon of the computing world. However, Engelbart is not alone enough to sort of tie the personal computing industry, or the development of the personal computing idea, to the counterculture. For this point, I think that Markoff mostly relies upon the stories of those who passed through the artificial intelligence laboratory and those who passed through Engelbart's augment project. He focuses a lot on those that worked in the research institutions and the lives that they lived outside of these institutions. And the sort of two crucial figures to tying this to the counterculture are Larry Tesler and Fred Moore. Larry Tesler was a worker at the Stanford Artificial Intelligence Laboratory. And even though, of course, Tesler was not terribly interested in artificial intelligence, his work at the laboratory mostly pertained to making the systems at the laboratory easier to use, i.e. more interactive, which is sort of the underlying ethos of the personal computing industry. And Larry Tesler continued this focus on ease of use in his later work. And what ties Larry Tesler to the counterculture is Larry Tesler had been actively involved in anti-Vietnam efforts. He'd been involved with the Free University, which was obviously in the spirit of sort of the democratic, anarchic, communistic, if you will, spirit of the day. It detached itself from local universities to provide a more open education. In addition, Larry Tesler left computing for a while to go live on a commune in Oregon, an almost, at this point, a countercultural cliche. Larry Tesler had a deep involvement in the countercultural movement and a deep involvement in the research being done at Stanford. The other character that is most convincing as to the countercultural ties of the personal computing idea to the counterculture, or the ties of the counterculture to the personal computing idea, is that of Fred Moore. Fred Moore was a longtime activist and somewhat of a nomad, much like many of his other brothers and sisters in the countercultural movement. And although Fred Moore worked in the research institutions at Stanford, aforementioned, Fred Moore is perhaps most well known today for his work with the Homebrew Computing Club. This is sort of the club that's known for really bringing computing to the people, making computers something that could be used by hobbyists, by people who weren't working in large research institutions. And Fred Moore did not certainly coin this sort of endeavor. The Homebrew Computer Club was founded after the earlier People's Computer Company, a name that pays both tribute to communist nations and to the famed psychedelic rock band, the Big Brother Holding Company. After that sort of broke down. Outside of these two, and outside of the personalities of Tesla and Moore, Markoff relies on other sorts of anecdotal evidence to tie the research being done at Stanford to the counterculture. And one of the things he brings up that's interesting is the MIT this sort of hacker manifesto that might have been, or at least I think was, affirmed by those working at this Stanford Artificial Intelligence Laboratory. And this manifesto emphasized freedom of information, a decentralization of computing. Something, of course, that obviously is an obvious precursor to today's internet world and, peer-to-peer file sharing world. So I think that through the anecdotal evidence and through the lives of Larry Tesler and Fred Moore, Markoff is able to sort of successfully to tie at least some of the personal computing idea to the counterculture. Now, although the title of Markoff's novel is how the 60s counterculture shaped the personal computing industry, from the language that Markoff uses, it's very clear that he believes that it more than shaped it, that it was sort of the genesis of it, I believe. But as sort of an assessment of Markoff's claims, I don't really know to what extent that comes across or that belief of Markoff is proved by his novel. He sort of constructs Douglas Engelbart as being this sort of hero, this visionary genius. The first chapter of the novel even refers to Douglas Engelbart as a prophet. This is sort of quasi-deification that we're talking about here. So, for there to be some sort of influence of the counterculture on the genesis of personal computing, Douglas Engelbart would have had to have had meaningful experiences with the counterculture. But the simple point of it is that Engelbart did not. The roots of the counterculture of this era, of course, are in the sort of lysergic experience. And Markoff, in earlier chapters of the novel, goes to great extent to talk about sort of the lysergic gospel and the people proselytizing. But Douglas Engelbart only had a handful of experiences with uses of acid. And Markoff even acknowledges that these were not fruitful. In an experience where Douglas Engelbart took acid and tried to invent something, all he invented was a ball that you put in a toilet so that kids can have fun peeing. That's hardly a meaningful interaction with the counterculture. However, even though that the counterculture may not have had an influence on the genesis of personal computing, I firmly, after reading Markoff's novel, agree with him that sort of genesis lies with the Augment Project and with Douglas Engelbart. I think what ultimately brought computing to the people, the action of creating personal computing, was strongly influenced by the counterculture. And I think this is shown most effectively in his discussion of Fred Moore and his Homebrew Computer Club. The Homebrew Computer Club was ultimately what brought computing to the people. And even though the idea of bringing computing to the people had existed, it hadn't been thus far done. Even though people were working towards it, this was still a sort of esoteric thing for those interested in computer science and in the future of computing. So, I think Markoff's novel is enough to make the claim that the counterculture influenced or shaped, as Markoff says in his title, the idea of personal computing. It certainly wasn't part at all of the genesis of personal computing. The idea was already in place. I mean, Douglas Engelbart's visions included not only these workstations, which you might know from your literally everyday life, because that's what computers are today, but also a vision of an interconnectedness between computers. Douglas Engelbart had this complete vision of computing that sort of now exists. So I don't think that the counterculture, because of Engelbart's only brief skirmishes, really had any influence on his vision, especially because this vision was sort of put into place around 1950, nearly 16 years before the counterculture sort of exploded. And that's even before many of its predecessors. So the influence of the counterculture on personal computing is certainly there, but it's much less thorough, I think, than Markoff claims.